Are we real or not? I guess that's the first question we need to ask ourselves. Yep, mic drop. So,
Depends on what you believe.
oh, definitely, definitely. So when it comes to experience, reality, we get philosophy, we go deep in philosophy straight away, and people love to debate backwards and forwards. But we're going to take a step back. We're going to take a little step back, and we're going to go, okay, fictional versus non-fictional, rather than am I experiencing reality? I would argue yes, but nah. Fantasy writing, fantasy in any way, just non-fiction writing. Well, I say fantasy, but it's also sci-fi and everything else. Those worlds are made up. Magic is made up. I know, shock horror. It doesn't exist.
How could you do that to me?
You can't wave a wand or I don't even know what other magicy things are. Click your fingers. Like you can't do those things and things just magically happen.
How do you know?
I'm not even going to entertain that with an answer.
Couldn't help it.
Yeah, so fantasy is something that I've been in dream world. I'm spaced out. I'm not paying attention. Whatever. All the way through school. Like I'm always spaced out, thinking elsewhere. Right. I'm not thinking werewolves and vampires, but I'm certainly not thinking about what's going on right now. And I've always loved watching sci-fi films, movies, series, and stuff because TV was my get out. It was okay, I'm going to read academic scientific work, then for my fun break consumption, I'll watch TV. Then when I went to uni, I was like, oh, actually, you can actually learn quite a lot on YouTube and online. So I started watching fantasy stuff on my computer. So I guess the barrier, the line was blurred a bit. And then believe it or not, I started watching documentaries on TV. So suddenly my fictional and my non-fictional worlds, mediums collided.
Mm.
I don't know whether you're similar.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm still very much. We're on the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who this month, so I'm a Whovian, so I'm very much in that.
I used to watch Doctor Who. I think David Tennant was probably the last good Doctor Who that
Oh, we
I
we can start fighting about that. That's fine.
that I liked watching anyway. I say
You know
I
he's back, don't you?
I I knew that he was kind of back, but I don't know enough about it. Like when you say he's
Yeah,
back, is he like the
he
main?
is doing. Yeah, he is literally the 14th Doctor.
Oh wow. Okay. I
Yeah,
mean,
he's come back to be the 14th Doctor, but it's only for 3 episodes, and then it's the 15th. Some really wacky, weird stuff's going in the Who
in the Who world.
in the Who world. So
Yeah. I stopped following after I think it was 11 or 12 Doctors. Like wherever the number was meant to end. Like I watched that sort of season and then the season
oh,
after.
Matt Smith.
Yeah, that's the one. I could see his face. I couldn't picture the name though. Yeah. So Matt Smith was probably the last Doctor that I watched, and then it just got a bit too. How do I guess a B movie. Does that make sense? Does that term come across? I know it's a term that we use
Yeah.
in the family. It's like it wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. It's kind of like just a B movie. It's like meh. I can watch this, but I'd rather watch something else. Um, that's how it came across, and that's when I stopped watching it. Sometimes I dabble back in, but every time I start watching it again, I'm like, yeah, yeah, it's okay. Maybe you're like, nope, nope, it's just as good as ever.
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not. Going back and rewatching it, it is not as good as it was. I mean, the 13th, she's a really good actress, but she was pooed on by really bad writing.
Yeah, and
Like really, really bad writing.
that's exactly where I wanted to take this episode. So thank you for the segue that you didn't know about.
You're welcome. I planned, obviously.
Telepathy, you see. We
Mm.
know. We know. Um, or the relationship in the environment just constrained itself so that it emerged, which I would likely put as the explanation rather than telepathy, but you never know. The writing of fantasy, the writing of stories is something I've always been interested in. I've been following Stephen King as a writer of stories for probably 2 years now. It doesn't sound long, but when you're actually following a writer, 2 years is a long time because you can
Mm.
easily go through someone's back catalogue in a couple of months and then become very familiar with the stories that they tell. Brandon Sanderson is the other writer, author that I followed a lot in the last year and a half because he documents a lot of his writing online. It's got an online series for those unfamiliar, and I've actually written a Substack article about writing like Brandon Sanderson
I
because
read that. It was interesting. It was different.
different in what way?
It was just interesting to see you write about a different topic.
Ah, well, is that a good, different, bad? Obviously,
Oh,
good and
yeah,
bad is
no,
subjective, but
it was interesting. It was. It wasn't what I was expecting. It subverted my expectations, which is nice. So, oh, he's writing about writing. That's kind of cool. I'll read that. So
yeah, it's interesting to experience NaNoWriMo the way that I am because, as I mentioned in the Discord event yesterday, my writing is scientific. Like that's all I've done. At school, I hated reading, didn't like books at all. We had homework at school, and my mum and I would sit on the sofa downstairs, and she'd say, "Right, you got to read our 10 pages today," and I would just read word after word. I didn't pay attention to what I was reading, didn't listen to the story. It was just word, no punctuation, just reading the words to make sure that I'd read the 10 pages so I could leave and go do something else, play sport, basically. And as I've got older, I've still not liked reading. Still, like even now, I don't. Uh, I don't enjoy scientific reading. I'm gonna be careful how I say that because I don't enjoy reading scientific papers, like word after word, going through the story. I enjoy following problem solving, curiosity. So I'll find an academic paper, I'll jump down to the description or the discussion, then I'll fly up, have a quick look at the abstract, then make a conclusion. Like I don't class that to me as reading a story.
no,
It's reading, don't get me wrong, but I'm not reading a story. I'm reading information that I want.
yeah,
And that's how I've just done my reading. And writing is kind of similar. I've always done my writing with points. I've had this point, I want to build up an argument or make some claims or share some thoughts on some discussion points that's going on. And that's how I've done my writing. That's how academic writing works. That's how scientific publishing works. And that's what we discussed yesterday in the event. But because I'm writing fictional, kind of turns it on its head. Like, yeah, you have your plot outlines, yeah, you have your storyline, but every word matters. And it's not density. In scientific publishing, you look at a sentence and
it's
you could have,
dense, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah,
you could have like 3 or 4 concepts mentioned in there, and you have a lot of pre information, pre knowledge, prior expectations that you need to grasp to some extent to really know what they're talking about. Like you mentioned about the paper that you're reading. I imagine if you didn't know what nonlinear pedagogy was, what ecological dynamics was, you'd read a sentence and go, "What the f is talking about?"
there were still sentences in there that I was like, what? Okay, look at that word. Okay, cool. Now I understand it. Right, cool. Look at that word. Okay, cool. Now I understand it. Right, okay. Why don't you just say that?
Yes. And that to me is the bridge between scientific publishing and fantasy writing storytelling. If you have a normal, whatever you class as normal, average, typical, um, neurotypical, dare I say it? I've published that video. But
Yeah,
yeah,
we'll talk about that later. Anyway, as we'll
yeah.
go off on one massive tangent.
uh, yeah, so the typical adult when they read a scientific paper is likely gonna go, "What the fuck? Why is it so difficult? Why is it so complicated? Why is it behind a paywall?" Video coming out next week about that. There's just so many complications with the reading process. You can't just give an adult a scientific paper and say, hey, what do you think? But you can give most adults a book, a fantasy book, and say, what do you think? And within a first couple of pages, will say, I don't like the sound of this person, or this seems really like weird. The environment, the magic, the something is odd. Like they get a feeling.
Yeah,
Scientific papers, you don't get a feeling at all.
that's interesting. I do.
Okay, when I say I don't get a feeling, I
Oh,
don't.
do you mean like a feeling as in you don't get a feeling of what's being written, or you don't have it's more of a reaction I'm getting more than a feeling? Is that what you're meaning? Yeah.
Yeah. Good poke. When I refer to feeling, I'm thinking scientific paper. I don't get a feeling of this is an exciting story. This is a story I want to follow. This like I'm not following a narrative through my interest in the storyline. It's not a
Okay.
it's not a feeling of excitement about the story or the characters or the setting or anything like that. When I'm reading scientific publishing, I don't care about the author. I don't care about the research most of the time. I don't care about the methods most of the time. What I care about is the information and my own personal challenge. Which, yes, obviously there are feelings. Every experience has a feeling. Going all the way back to the start of the episode. We feel something, but it's not a feeling of, oh, I really want to read the rest of this paper. I don't get that feeling when I'm reading scientific papers. I can read like 4 sentences in a scientific paper and be like, yep, satisfied.
Mm,
you can read the conclusion and be, yep, I'm satisfied. The rest of it is redundant.
that's so
Most
interesting.
most books, fantasy books, science fiction books, adult books, you can't just read the last page and say, yep, satisfied. You can with some, don't get me wrong, but most be like, okay, I don't know who this person is. Where are we? Why are we in a pub, or why are we in a forest, or what's this magic thing going on? Like there's so much there. I I hadn't got that before. Now that yeah, I am reading fantasy books. It's opened up my eyes to a different type of reading and therefore a different type of writing.
Mm. Because I know you dabbled in writing fiction,
Short stories, yeah.
like short story fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
I recognize I'm talking a lot. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, it kind of seems we're talking about fantasy world and all of that stuff. For me, what I've started doing, so I run, for people who don't know, I run D&D for one, two, three groups now. One online, two in person.
What
And
is
so
D&D?
oh yeah, Dungeons and Dragons, for people who don't know what that is, which
I know where you're going with this. I had no idea what D&D stood for up until about 7, 8 months ago. I knew
because
D&D
of
was a thing, but I
was
didn't.
it because of Stranger Things?
Yes,
That's yeah, of course.
like
That's why it is.
I knew of D&D, but I had no idea what it was. All I like the way I thought about it was this is some mystical magical game thing
Oh
that
yeah,
are
it's Mystical Magical. Oh yeah.
yeah with some nerdy people talking, and that's about as far as I got. All I had was an image of like nerdy kids around a table talking about something, but I didn't know what, how, where, why, anything.
It's pretty cool. But yes, as I was saying, like you were talking about the difference between the scientific part and like the storytelling, that element. It's really interesting because the way that I think of one shot, so one shot is a single session where they come up with characters and we just do one thing. It's about 3 to 4 hours long, and at the end, the story's over. And a one shot is much more almost scientific in the way that it's put together. It's you get together 3 to 4 encounters, you have a little bit of exposition, a little bit of story, but they're not there for that deep immersion. They're there to play a game. And so that's where the focus is. Whereas one thing that I'm doing now with my campaigns, which is a long-term D&D game. How long it goes, who the heck knows? It depends on life and people and everything. Is very much weaving things together, creating stories as they emerge. It is very much an ecological approach to writing fiction because I have a very, very rough outline of where I want my people to go, but it is incredibly like not got much detail to it. I have a basic outline of a story, and then I put situations in front of my party to make decisions, and depending on what they decide to do will influence the story. And it's been fun with this recent group that I've started working on. I have a little bit more time because it's all online, so I don't have to make maps and um so so it allows me to really get their stories. And so something has just happened where one of them has picked up a dragon egg,
Right.
which means they're trying to hatch a dragon. And I'm like, oh, yes, thank you. So that can now become a big part of their story because of their actions. Kind of the world reacts to them, which is how I build it. But I find it really fun to just you have the area that they're staying in and the world around them, and it slowly builds out from the characters out with little snippets of things on the outside.
So how much of the world are you creating and building, and how much is it by the creators, the players even?
I wouldn't even say I'm building the world to.
When I say world, I'm thinking world building. So that's like how the magic works, the settings, the cultural expectations, the people,
So
those sorts of things.
most of that is built into D&D.
Right.
So there is less work there, but I could go absolutely nuts and do all of that stuff. I
That's
just never
that's what I've been
get,
enjoying.
huh?
I said that's what I've been enjoying.
That is where I could go and will go in the future because I'm still a relatively new DM and I'm still getting my hang around all of the other pieces. But currently I start from a predetermined world, but it has a basic outline and a basic kind of like framework to go from, the culture, what they're like, whether it's this, whether it's that. And then I change what I want based on how I'm interacting with the party, how the party's interacting with the NPCs, how they interact with each other, what they want to do, their backstories, because they've all written very wonderful backstories, which has given me so much juicy stuff to use. And so it's I have a world, but it's more co-created.
Right. Yeah, because when I think about D&D and I think about the worlds that you're in, because you create some of it, you're in some of it, it's very I don't play D&D, so I can't say much, but from my experience of listening to people talk about it, it's very much sensory focused. If that makes sense. When you're explaining what is going on, you can imagine where you are. You can imagine
Mm,
what's going on. You can see the old building or the wooden things or the creaky chairs, the floorboards, that sort of stuff, or the leaves and whatever. Like, it's very sensory driven rather than so. To bring some ecological information in here, it's ecological information, but through organismic senses, like the physical senses,
yeah.
rather than through abstract thinking and cognition, which is what scientific publishers focus on. That sort of information. It's not as abstract. It's much more physical world, even though it's imagined.
Mm,
So even though it's this abstract thinking, it's still physical.
yes.
And to me, when I think about that theoretically, that's very interesting that you can be in one physical environment, but also be in another physical environment at the same time through language, through emotions.
And one of the things that I am in practice to do is to bring more of that, like, because you can have it just, oh, you come up and you see some goblins and you go fight them. And it's just roll this, do that, roll this, do that, and very mechanical, which is fine. And for those who like that, that's fine. And then you've got the complete opposite end of the stick, which is things like Dimension 20 and Critical Role, where they basically just talk all the time and it's barely a game. And I like that but it's for entertainment. And my job as the GM is to be in the middle of that.
What's the difference between GM and DM? I assume Game Master and Dungeon
So
Master are
Game
slightly
Master,
different.
DM, from my understanding, DM is primarily Dungeons and Dragons. GM is multiple kind of it's more universal term.
Okay. Yeah, when I think about the sensory elements, obviously when you're telling stories in scientific world, in scientific publishing, you don't need sensory elements. You don't need to explain the lab settings. You don't need to explain how the participants could have felt. Yeah, you might get a bit of that in the discussion, but that's only going to be in a psychology paper, and that's if they think it's mildly relevant to the topic they're talking about. Everything else is just to the point, dense, blunt information. Whereas fantasy storytelling, you get into everything else. And that's what I've been enjoying. That's what, because I started writing and it was just a sentence of a thing. And I'm like, I can now like fluff it up, as it were. Like I can add things to this. It doesn't have to be this clinical sentence of words. And that's what's fun. That's why the words are building out. For those interested in my NaNoWriMo journey, I'm doing a daily journal, which you can find inside of the Discord, and I will do a summary on YouTube eventually at the end of the month. But it's really expanding the way that I write. And what it's making me question is, okay, can we communicate science through more of a sensory story rather than a objective story? The immediate answer is yes, you can.
Yeah.
But what does that look like? And I've got some answers, but I want to hear your thoughts before. Maybe I'll rephrase it. What does science communication look like when the data is being told through stories?
Well, it looks like people sharing their experiences. That's what it is. That's literally what I do in our, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're sharing the science through stories.
So when we think about science communication through this sort of lens, is it science communication? Because most of the time, when I see people discuss science communication, it's a scientist, academic, PhD, someone with a certificate, or someone that's read lots of articles and papers telling other people something. This is what happened. These are the ideas, etc., etc. That's what I've seen science communication or SciComm explained as. Like you have SciComm YouTube channels. This one talks about the atmosphere. This one talks about medical something, and this one talks about physics, and this one talks about engineering. Like, what about the rest of the channels that are talking video essay channels that are talking about sociology and psychology? Are they SciComm?
Yeah.
So what isn't SciComm? I love asking this question. What isn't science communication? Because when you think about what science is, science to me is using the scientific method. Well, what is the scientific method? You have a hypothesis, you test said hypothesis, you find an ambiguous answer, so you test it again, and you test it again, and you keep going until you get closer to what you believe is a truth. The truth, I don't think, is real. A truth is more likely, especially with the dynamic world we live in. So when you see communication of science, if someone is communicating an answer or a potential answer to one of the tests, that could be science communication. So if you've done a test on yourself, a case study of one, and you communicate that test to someone else, is that science communication?
Well, yeah.
But that means anyone telling any story where they've done some sort of testing is science communication. Which a lot of people are going to be like, well, no. No. If you're making up a story, or if you're telling me your experience, that's not going to match mine. That's not going to be true for everyone. No, it's not going to be true for everyone. So that's you telling your story. That's
Neither
not
is the
you.
scientific papers either. Like the traditional science com is not gonna.
It's not going to cover everyone. No, exactly. And that to me is where this whole conversation gets very, very muddy. Because when you look at what isn't science communication, you need to draw lines. You need to create barriers. And what is science communication? The same thing. You need to draw lines. You need to make barriers. And I have a video coming out next week about this, but Veritasium, Derek Muller, posted a video 3 days ago now, 4 days ago now, about science communication. And at the end of it, he said some things that I disagree with. But the last point was in the body of scientific knowledge. And I'm like, what's that? What does that mean? If you have one person that has done tests, has an experience, and has results that match that experience with potential multiple causes, that hits the scientific method, it's followed the scientific method to an extent, and they can communicate that. And if they communicate that with other people, and other people believe it's true and also have similar experiences, that then becomes somewhat grouped knowledge. Conspiracy theorists. That's the accepted body of knowledge in that group of people, but not in another group of people. So what is and isn't good science communication? Well, it doesn't exist. You can't have a good science communication. You have communication of ideas. Ideas potentially using scientific method, but what does that really look like? Like, how can you have good, real, true science communication?
I think it's also kind of going back to D&D. It's a kind of a similar thing because if you look at the kind of pillars of D&D, where you have that exploration element, you have that kind of interaction with other people, and that role play, not quite right, that's not quite enough of it, but and then you have the combat. Some people love the combat, some people love tactical combat, some people can't really visualize in the same way, so need a map so that they can see what's happening, etc., etc. And so what makes a good DM or GM as such is how you adapt that to the group that you're in, because as you learn what the group likes, you'll be able to create more of that. And it's kind of a similar thing of like, yeah, just.
So when you think about a DM or a GM in Dungeons and Dragons or whatever game you're playing, do you see any similarities between them and science communicators?
Well, yeah, because it's their experience of their character. It's almost kind of a meta experience. It's an experience of their character's experience.
Yeah. And when I think about telling fantasy stories, I think it's the same thing as science communication. I know it's taken a while to get there, but that's what I'm thinking about at the moment. Telling fantasy stories, being a fantasy writer, a sci-fi writer, screenplay writer, whatever sort of writer it is, you're writing. And as we've mentioned before previously, writing is thinking, which means if writing is thinking and telling a story through writing is communication of ideas, and communication of ideas is science communication, well, then telling fantasy stories is science communication. So, how do you know what's real and what isn't real when it comes to the science being discussed? And that, to me, is where this fictional reality comes in. Because every story that's told through fiction has reality in there. There is real things, real objects being described or that could be described because they are real in the author's, readers' ways of experiencing that story, that world. When you think about remembering something from the past, that's a fictional reality. Remembering it is a fictional reality. Predicting the future, I would argue, is also a fictional reality. So when we're discussing fantasy writing, is it fictional reality that they're discussing, and is it science that they're discussing? I think a lot of people would like to argue against that. Harry Potter isn't science. Well, is it? Is Harry Potter science? Well, yeah, you can make the arguments because it's in a school. There are real elements to the story. There are lots of real elements to the story. Harry being in a school, Harry being having relationships with different friends and teachers, professors, and obviously Voldemort, I don't think anyway, is real. But there are elements in the story that are real. So how do you pick out the things that are and aren't real? And this is where my interest in the difference between telling a story to a child and telling a story to an adult changes. How familiar are you with the publishing industry inside of the fantasy world when it comes to like YA versus yeah? So the reason I think I don't like the adult books, because I've tried reading before multiple times, is they pad the theory, they pad the ideas. It's I'm not saying tropes are good or tropes are bad. Tropes are just things that happen throughout storytelling, right? But the tropes inside of adult storytelling, you almost know what's going to happen as soon as the story starts. And I see it in films and movies as well. Like the 3-star movies that I see, it's like, it was a good film, it had good explosions, all that sort of stuff, but you sort of know what's going to happen before you even start the film. Yeah, you look at it and go, okay, this person's going to like this person. This person's not going to like that person. This person's going to get over conflict with them. And this magic thing is going to be relevant at some point somewhere. And it's true to an extent in children's fantasy and sci-fi. But every time I read it, there's always twists and turns and relationships with people that you're like, oh, that's not what I was expecting. Okay, that's a bit different, or that's a bit dark.
It's more experiential.
And I would argue less constrained.
Yes. Yeah, because I think they are less constrained.
Yeah. So the way I'm looking at writing, or the way I'm writing at the moment, this fantasy novel, is through the lens of science communication, with minimal constraints, and trying to tell a story through sensory experiences. And when I look at those three things, that's what makes up a lot of these successful stories. Stephen King, Brandon Sanderson, J.K. Rowling, whether you like her or not, she's a good storyteller. She's got to be. She's written Harry Potter, which is, yeah. Even Tolkien to an extent with his Lord of the Rings series. Like when you look at them, they're science communication because they're communicating scientific ideas. Scientific in either the social sense, the psychological sense, or potentially the sci-fi fictional sense where technology could be true in some way. But they're also telling it with minimal constraints, which is where the fantastical element of this storytelling comes in, oftentimes through children's stories. Brandon's stories are not through children's. But he tells the stories in a way that has so much detail that you know what's going on, but there are still questions in it where you're like, what about? Or what if? Or does that person? And you start asking those questions. That's why I think he's successful with his writing. Um, and then the other element of all of this is obviously the sensory experiences. How do they experience the writing? And all of them, plus most good authors, take the author on a journey, take the readers on a journey,
Yeah.
which scientific publishing doesn't do. I don't think.
No.
So when it comes to telling stories, I'm going to pivot this towards you now. How would you go about telling a story to journal? I put in quote speech marks because obviously everyone has a story, and whenever anyone's communicating with someone else, they're telling their experience, their story. So how would you, or how could you, tell your story through a fantasy lens, I guess you could say, through an unconstrained, non-linear pedagogical lens? Yeah,
That's good. That is a good question, Al.
because it's a different spin on journaling.
Mm. I think the question, how could I, or how would I, is tripping me up because I would just write freely and create a world. That's interesting. That's fascinating.
So I guess as another reframe, when it comes to journaling, I would argue journaling is more like scientific writing,
Yes.
which is why I don't like it. I don't like
Yeah.
journaling. But if you were to tell a story, an unconstrained story in your world, and you can make up what you want, maybe that would get people journaling. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, obviously, is another conversation. But it's a way to write your experiences out. And I
And it's
haven't.
that's really interesting. Because one of the things that when it comes to writing stories, everyone's like, oh, I need to create your world, create the rules, and create this and create that, constrain yourself, otherwise XYZ. But then when you think about it in this way, the rules emerge, which is what's happened in all three of my D&D games. Things are emerging as the players interact with the world. And if I turn that on its head and I have it as a journal, how I interact with the world creates the rules, which is quite an interesting concept. And it's almost a storytelling way to write a pop,
Yeah, yeah,
which
didn't
is
think about
kind of
that, but
cool.
yeah.
Which is
And of
kind of
course,
cool.
because it's fictional, you can do what you want.
Yeah.
So if something does happen in the real world that you want to talk about, you can be like, well, I didn't like this. Obviously, it happened. So there's the constraints, but let's have a look at the affordances that I have inside of the world that I've built. Well, maybe instead of them being a goblin, because I don't like this person, and now they're a fairy, I've just turned them into a fairy. So you're now thinking of a person as a fairy instead of a goblin. What does that mean? How does that change your perspective on the way you see that person, the way you interact with that person? And yeah, you probably don't want to go up to him and say, hey, you're a fairy in my fictional world. I don't think that would go down very well. But you can reframe the way you think about either people, objects, experiences, skills through a fictional lens in your own world applied in the real world.
Mm.
That's how I would articulate in I guess a fantasy storytelling lens, how I've applied dynamical systems theory. You want to say something?
There it was an ad. that I think it was an ad the other day about dementia, and
Right.
it was told through a kind of high fantasy way of like
Interesting.
a prince and a prince and a princess. He saved her. They got married, and then he was afflicted by a curse, which the curse was dementia. And it's like it just triggered that, like, oh yeah, that's interesting. That's exactly what was happening there.
Yeah. Because I mean, when I spoke to kids, kids could tell you a story. Like if they knew what was happening in a book or what happened in a film, they could tell you everything. They can tell you all the details, all the interactions between the people and the magic and everything that's going on. Because the details of the story is what makes the story interesting because it's the experience that they're going through. But when you ask a kid to explain what it is that they're learning, I don't care. What were you doing at school? I don't care. I don't know. We did this thing. And that was it.
Mm.
There's not much to it. And whenever I ask kids, obviously this isn't sport, but when I ask kids to explain well, anything really, they didn't pay attention to the details because they didn't see the point in the details. It wasn't needed. But when you have a fantasy world, fantasy element of a world, maybe that makes the details more interesting.
Mm.
So instead of dementia being this abstract term that is hard to grapple with unless you understand the medical considerations and what's going on in the brain, even though we don't really know, instead of thinking of it as this medical condition we need to worry about, it's a curse or it's a spell or it's something. And you're like, oh, okay, now there's something else attached to it that, yeah, it's fantastical. It doesn't really make sense because you can't just whip your wand and be like, there you go, you have this curse now.
Which, quite frankly, is exactly how dementia feels because it just
But
happens.
exactly.
It's the same experience. It's just with a fantasy world with with answers as such.
But yeah, exactly. And I have no idea whether this could be used inside of therapy, but like when I think about my experiences with therapy, it was very clinical. It was very clinical. It didn't work. I went to multiple therapists. It didn't work. And how I got myself out of it by myself was through ecological dynamics and understanding the world through a different lens. And maybe the fantasy world is a potential different lens. I'm just spitballing it, just spitballing.
Yeah, no, it makes sense in a beautifully weird way.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's what I've been thinking about when it comes to the fictional reality element. Uh, when when you discuss or when you think about remembering, I'm curious to get your explanations on this through an ecological dynamics lens. If someone was to ask you about remembering, how would you explain it? Or memory, how would you explain it?
Ironically, this has been something that's been spoken about a lot at home
Oh,
because I'm noticing a lot coming from my little boy around. Oh, I just have a bad memory. I just have a bad this. I have a bad that, and I'm like, okay, but what does that mean? Like, do you have a bad memory? And he went, because I said, because for me, I don't think that memory in the way that it's explained exists in that way. We don't have a store, a thing to put it in. It's part of the environment that we're in. If you're looking for a charger,
is this
you're
what you're
looking.
saying to your son?
Yes,
Oh, right. Interesting.
he's very much, he likes to think about things in that way. I would term it very different for my daughter, but for he's very much, he would listen to these podcasts.
Right. That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And so it one of the things that he really struggles with is finding things because he doesn't look as such. And so he goes and literally just before I was coming on, he was downstairs shouting at everything because he couldn't find a charger. And his default reaction is to get us to look. But I'm like, no, this is an environment that you have partly created. Explore, and all of a sudden he finds it because he starts interacting with the environment around him instead of just standing there spinning around in one go. Well, I don't remember where it is. Okay, that's fine. But you're in this room. Did you have it in this room? Yes. Okay, then look around the room. Well, I don't know where to look. Okay. And then I add a constraint. Start over there. He starts over there, immediately finds it.
That to me is exactly the sorts of things that I had. Obviously I had to learn. I didn't have a parent like yourself just pointing me telling me, like, they didn't not do it, but my parents don't know what ecological dynamics is. It's
I
just
think it's you don't have the language, do they?
well,
So
yeah,
you had to figure it out yourself over
yeah.
time. And then the more I think about my own experience, it's exactly the same.
I
I had a
I
little bit too much help from my family.
uh,
So
I
there was a lot of reliance,
I can
which I'm
relate.
avoiding doing. So I leave him to explore it a little bit, but constrain the environment for him.
Coach.
So yeah, I coach him. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's
And
actually
it's really
what.
interesting. It's really interesting as well, like flipping this to the business perspective and coming back into Notion consulting because someone asked for some help. And I'm like, okay, cool. How would I do this from that approach versus what I did before? And it was interesting how it was only small changes I made because I was already kind of doing it, but I didn't have the language or the expertise around that. I was kind of on that very thin plinth, but now I've slowly been like, oh, 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 oh. And as I'm gaining more confidence in it as well, confidence in the expertise, it's like, okay, cool. This is it's not, it's almost as if it's not effort. There's no effort because it's just like, okay, cool here. Okay, cool here.
Break
Okay,
that
cool here.
down. Break that
Hmm?
down. What do you mean by minimal effort?
Hmm. I'm attuned to it. Is the ecological I am attuned to the environment where constraints can be added. I'm like, oh, this is a place. Oh, this is a place. Oh, this is a place. Oh, I can set this database as small self-contained experiments that the client can interact with so that they gain expertise in using Notion, they gain expertise in writing standard operating procedures inside of Notion instead of having them do it everywhere, which is what they were doing previously. And so I have got that constraint on that, and it allows them to see different things and interact and go, oh, I want to do this, and I don't like how this is done. I want to do it like this. I want to do this, and I'm like, yes, cool, good. This goes into the bigger system. Everything that's being said goes into the bigger system.
Yep. Yeah, it's I don't, I don't know what it is about the relationship between the coach and it's not the athletes, obviously, and it's not athletes, coach and person, teacher and student, that relationship. When you have a coach or a teacher that's good at what it is they do, they tend to use ecological or ecologically valid practices, even though they may not know about it.
Yeah.
So when I'm looking at the effective teachers, the expert teachers, they use ecological principles. But when they find struggling areas or difficulty in doing certain things, it's when they haven't applied something from the ecological approach in in the way that they would advise, and they lean towards cogpsych. What?
It reminds me of a course I recently got to do with automations and tech and that. And I'm like, oh, this could be beautiful from an ecological approach. Let me watch it. And then there was some like, yes, yes, setting up in the environment. Yes, 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 yes. And then immediately overload, brain. So close.
But that's the thing, like it's almost like a hey, here's the ideal world that we need to pay attention to, ecological dynamics. But because we work like this, we're going to go over here. And I'm like, no, you don't need to go over there. You don't need to constrain yourself to this box in your brain or this limit that you have or this synaptic neural pathway
It
energy
just
stuff. It's just
sucks. It just sucks.
that's where I think the science has constrained the thinking to be cog-like because we need the scientific method to work, which is fine. But when we remove some of the constraints and be a little bit more dynamic, we see the fantasy world that is ecological dynamics.
Mm.
Maybe that's what it is. Maybe I'm enjoying fantasy writing because it's very similar to ecological dynamics and the
That's
way
why
the
I'm enjoying
ecological.
D&D. I recognize that quite quickly.
Ah, well, because it's freeing to. What?
It's not even just the fan. I am building a world through interactions with the environment is my other players, and then they are building interactions and things emerge over time depending on what they are attracted to. I hear someone mention this, they're attracted to the dragon. Okay, cool, fine. I'm going to use that because they're interested in that. They come to me behind the scenes to go, this is what I don't want to see. Okay, cool. Those are the constraints that I work within. Does that fit within the world? Is that ecologically? Yeah, I could do that. Yes. And this is how it would work and how I would twist this way and do this to make it interesting, to make it entertaining, to make it fun. And so just a lot of my planning is around creating those opportunities for them.
Opportunities for behavior, i.e., affordances.
Yeah.
So I guess a question to you then, as we move. Yeah,
And also because I play in games too. And there is a game that I'm playing where I created what a divination wizard who could predict the future, who could influence roles, which is very, very powerful in D&D. And I was like, this is interesting, but it was kind of constrained to a point where there was no point in doing it. And I'm like, see, I wouldn't do that. Like if I was running the game, if someone creates a divination wizard, they want to be able to do that. So I would use that. However, that puts it in the world, which means I have access to it too. And that for me is like one of the big things is there's a spell called Silvery Barbs, which is banned on most tables because
interesting.
it's too powerful. Silvery Barbs basically means you can have a reaction. You can go, nope, you didn't roll that. Nope, you didn't do that. And also give advantage to someone else. That was also constrained on my side as well. Now, bear in mind, I've not experienced it from a GM side, so that's fine. But like I told my group, I said, look, if you would like so, because someone mentioned it, I'm like, you want Silvery Barbs? Have Silvery Barbs. I'll know you have Silvery Barbs. But if you have Silvery Barbs, that means my monsters can have it too. Because it's in the world, it's in the environment.
Yep.
And for me, I find that more rewarding from a player's perspective and a DM's perspective, because then I get to see how they interact and how they use those spells or those abilities. And then I will react in kind, or the enemies and the big bad will react in kind, because how they play influences how they react. And that to me almost, and this could be my inexperience, I don't know, but so far, I've seen how they interact with each other, and I'm like, okay, cool, I can do this next time. Okay, cool. I see no that's how they would behave slightly differently this time because they know about and as they go through the game, they become more well known. And as they become more well known, that means I will have more that's the point.
Yeah.
And so it allows me to play with that.
Now, hearing you explain it, I'm just I can picture all of the stories because you've got like the plot line, and the plot line is obviously developing as you go. You've got your main characters, and if something's added into the world when you're writing a story, obviously you're adding it into a reader. Everyone else needs to know about the thing. Like you can't just go towards the end of a book say, hey, this magical thing that you know nothing about has suddenly like solved the game or solved the problem, whatever it is. No, like the rest of the people need to know about it to some extent, or it needs to be introduced or foreshadowed or something, which is interesting in the way that you're explaining like the spells in that when you introduce something, everyone else can see it. And it's the same in like real life. If something is introduced, if something is known, COVID, everyone's got to deal with it. And the the environment then changes. Like the entire
Mm-hmm.
environment then changes. It's not
and,
just
and
one
that and
person.
that is the whole thing, because all of the characters change the environment, how they behave. I've something happened to me which I thought was fantastic skill of from the DM of like, I asked to change my class because it was the divination wizard. I wasn't really having any fun because I couldn't use all the abilities to help my party. And I'm very much like, I am the person who likes to help and change things for other people. Shock horror to everybody who knows me. That's kind of what I like doing. But I couldn't do that because the divination wizard was limited to just me. So the abilities could only help me, which is fine because wizards are squishy as anything. They die very quick. So yes, it kind of works. But I
No, no,
wasn't
they're
enjoying it.
Gandalf. They don't die. They're everlasting.
No, in D&D, it's they're famous for basically if you fall over a bin, you die. Because they have so little health. Very funny. So I asked to change class, which was fine. I changed to a cleric, a healer, basically, primarily. A healer and can get up front and punch things. But that had a world reaction to me doing that. And he
Right.
used that on me yesterday. And I'm like, yes.
No, but yes.
Yeah, it was like, oh no, it was good because he's got some pips on there, which something's going to happen when I fill them up. But I don't know, obviously, but I know something's going to happen. And I had a feeling because we went to see a red wizard, which is basically the darkest and evilest of wizards. And there was a bunch of skeletons and undead. And I went, oh, great. Because my deity that gave me the powers loathes undead.
Ah.
So as I walked in there and there was a bunch of undead and we're going to get their help from him, that's not good. Because the reaction I should have done is attack them. Because the deity that gave me my power to become a cleric loathes it. And I'm like, yes, you've made it actually matter. And I also equally do not like you for that. And it
I
was
mean,
fun seeing it from the two different perspectives. My character don't have a clue what's happening, but I
yeah.
did.
You're
And I'm
like,
like,
I like that.
I'm just like, yes, yes, I'm in so much trouble.
That just you explaining that there, that is more memorable because of the experiences, the experience that it has, the consequences, the real life consequences, and that's what's missing in so much education. It's like, yeah, just make education a game, and not a game as in winning points and losing points. No, a game is in experiences that go through. That's fun. Imagine that. Imagine doing like a term of English, for example, playing a DNT, playing in a D&D type style, like
So
English or history or geography or art.
the kids actually joined us for a D&D game
Oh
and
yeah.
actually played D&D because we were down a number of people who couldn't make it due to having to reschedule. And so I was just like, well, kids can join. And they loved it. Now they're minutely obsessed. Oops. I got home there and went, can we just play like every day? I'm like,
No.
the amount of work that goes into creating sessions. No. Once a week, maybe, but not daily.
That would turn into your life.
Yeah.
Ooh, homeschooling.
Yeah.
if you were homeschooling, you could probably do a D&D style day, because a D&D session is just like a coaching session. You prep whatever it is that you want to do, and then you do the day.
And then you've got things like the cooking and the crafting, and then going out and earning money, and the whole. Oh, now that's got my head thinking.
Yeah. I don't know whether you're going to do homeschooling at some point, but it's certainly interesting considering.
And then you've got the lack of social interaction, quote unquote, which is not lacking because you have a D&D session and people are interacting. Oh, that's dangerous thoughts.
But it doesn't have to be D&D. It's just inspired by D&D.
Yeah.
Because you can create your own world. So forget the D&D rules, go really abstract, really non-linear, and say, okay, we're going to play in a world. Maybe, like them being children, they can come up with creating parts of the world as you go.
Mm.
So, okay, we're going to learn this today. You are this person, you have these skills. We're going to develop these skills because you need to go over there and do this thing later on. So maybe at the end of the month, you need to fight something, beat something, do something. Obviously, it's not going to work for every child, but it's a way of looking at it, because that's how I would coach the kids at football. A lot of the kids didn't understand why they needed to practice passing. I'm like, well, because at the end of the week we're going to do this challenge or this game or this thing, and if you suck, you're not going to be very good at it, basically. And people, it's not that they didn't like, it's not they didn't want to. It wasn't the losing or the winning that was the thing. It was they didn't want to look bad. Like they didn't want to look bad in front of everyone else, which is understandable. But the winning of the game wasn't down to them winning in points because of the way that I had created it. They were either in teams, so they needed to help one another, or it was being measured by progress. And that's what I did a lot inside of football, because a lot of the football things is obviously how many goals you scored, how many times you did this, how fast you did that. I was like, okay, progress. If you in the first time, so they didn't know this to start with. In the first time they play the game, oh, you got a score of 5, make it easy numbers. You got a score of 5. Okay. Now in the next month, they're going to develop different skills. And at the end of it, they're going to do it again. But because they tried really hard the first time, they're going to need to try really hard the second time if they're going to beat it. And you need to beat it by more than the last time. So they looked at themselves and were like, okay, I need to improve myself and be better myself. And I created an environment over time through a story for them to do that. They were creating the narratives themselves. But inside of more abstract topics like philosophy, geography, like anything really at school inside of the national curriculum, you could add that storyline. Not necessarily in a fantastical world in fictional reality, but you can still tell those stories through all the things that we've discussed through the episode. I think that's really cool.
That is really cool.
And that's essentially what I did. Just not with wizards and goblins and all the rest of it. I guess as a fantastical question for you, for someone that knows more about the worlds than I do, I know you've got the dark and the light, you've got the natural and the non-natural and all of that with the magics and the wizards and stuff. Why is it wizarding world? Why is it not witches world? Can you have like male witches?
Yeah.
But that's where I get confused. I'm like, I don't hear of female wizards, but I hear of male witches, and I don't.
You know, actually.
And I don't hear about a witch's world or the witching world. It's the witch and something. Whereas it's the wizarding world. It's like this big social group of wizards, which is fine. Or you have a witch in some world that's fantastical in some way. It seems like the witch is a person, a character, a thing, but the wizarding world is like a setting. Like, why? I don't get it.
And I don't get it either.
Okay. Well, I was wondering if I was missing something. I was like,
No, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You could very easily say it's gender bias.
Well, yeah, that's the initial.
That's probably the answer I would go with.
Yeah, because of I would imagine because of the start of the fantasy stuff is built off of old assumptions. But yeah, because I was as part of the research, I say loosely, for the book that I'm writing, and I'm not going to spoil it on recording, I've been looking into different areas of the storyline I want to share. And I'm trying to look for other stories for inspiration. I can't fucking find any. And I'm like, surely there is a book that does this like this in this way.
So, could you look at your real life?
That's what I'm doing. But I'm like, I'm looking for tropes or ways other authors have written about certain things that I want to explore, and I just can't find them. It might be because I'm not searching in the right place, or I haven't found the right author, the right trope, the right something, but everyone talks about the same shit. It's so frustrating.
I'd be super intrigued. This is completely beside what you've just said. How are you using Obsidian for this? Of course you are. For your world building, you were using Obsidian,
That's
I
a dumb
assume.
question.
Because you might have used a dedicated tool. You might have.
Uh, so for those that watch YouTube that are still in this recording, yesterday I had a bit of a tool dilemma. And I actually went back to Word for a little bit. Yeah, I know. Because okay.
You okay?
Okay. You can watch the full recording thingy on in the Discord, but essentially, Supercharged Links came out with an update, which is a plugin in Obsidian, which broke my Obsidian, so I couldn't use Obsidian until the bug fix was done, or I disabled the plugin, which was fine, but I didn't know
Yeah,
it was that.
supercharged link broke bad.
Yeah, but it's fixed now. They fixed it after a couple of hours. But yeah, so during my first 2 hours of the writing session, I I couldn't use the features that I would normally use because I didn't realize it was supercharged links at the time. I just disabled all the plugins, so I couldn't use data view or metadata menu or quick add because all the plugins. I was like, I'm just going to disable them all because I still want to be able to write stuff. So I went to Word because Brandon Sanderson uses Word and he uses the outline view in Word when he's writing.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, let's try this. So I started using that. And then I went back to Obsidian. And essentially, I'm using the Quiet Outline plugin as a replacement for the outline inside of Word. Because the reason I don't like outline in Obsidian, the core outline, is it doesn't fold. So if you have tons of outlines, tons of headings, you end up scrolling up and down the outline and you're like, where am I? What am I doing? Whereas Word, it was far easier to navigate that with the levels, but it was clicking buttons. So I'm using the Quiet Outline to do that. And now my book, instead of being in multiple files using the long form plugin, it's just one file in the Quiet Outline. You're going to say something?
Yeah, no, that's what I thought. One file.
Yeah. So now it's just one file where I'm scrolling up and down. So the book's in one file, the outline's in the other file, and the outline has, at the moment, all of the world building. It doesn't have like the individual files for the characters, for the magic, for the scenes, for the places, for everything else. They are linked, obviously, in Obsidian. But I've got the data view queries, which feed into the canvas, which gives me everything. So I have a canvas which shows me literally everything that's happening in the world. And it's extremely fun. But yeah.
Show me everything after we stop recording. You will suck.
But yeah, the fantastical worlds I'm reading, they're all the same, which is understandable. But I'm like, but why isn't it like this? Why hasn't anyone done this? I can't figure out why. But yeah. There's one more thing I wanted to bring up, which is a comment from the U of Tubes. And it's the comment on the Aiden video is about memories, because obviously we referred to memories earlier, and they said when they are talking about past memories and not actually remembering them, they said it's a good thing to mention that when they're talking about memories, it's better to talk about them rather than just sort of like reflect on them. And I wanted to just briefly mention that that's the way that I see all of this, like the fictional reality, the storytelling, the remembering, the experiencing things through stories, through narratives, through other experiences, like sensory experiences, and looking at all of the details. That to me is what remembering is. When you're remembering something, it's you in a fictional reality, a hallucination, as it were, of the experiences that you've had in the past, or your recreations of the potential experiences you've had in the past, because it's not accurate, rather than looking at memories, because memories are a captured data point, as it were. But the data point is going to be limited with the amount of data you captured. If you put down a couple of words, well, you're still recreating memories from those couple of words. Got a picture, video, same sorts of things. So when you think about a journal, and Aiden's journal, if it didn't have all the data, he was still using remembering as a process to go back there. Do the triggers help? Of course they do, but they're environmental triggers to create the story in the world.
Yeah.
Could you get there through another medium? Yes, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts?
No?
Right. Well, thank you for everyone listening to our fantastical reality.
Oh dear.
Yep. But